We'll start with doing a little bit of um, meditation and review, uh, and generating a motivation. So, like to generate a motivation, we'll review a little bit what we discussed last week and meditate on. Spend a few minutes meditating on that. So, yeah, if you'll remember, last week we went over the meaning of samsara and nirvana, and just a little bit about the Four Noble Truths. Um, yeah, so we'll think about those briefly. But first, get comfortable in your meditation posture, wherever you are. And, sure. Um, So let's just sit quietly for a minute and gather our attention inwards. Focus on an object of meditation, either your breath or your mind or a visualized object, whatever you choose. And then become aware of the state of your mind, whether it's virtuous or neutral or non-virtuous, peaceful or disturbed, or however. Just be aware of the state of your mind. And then since when we generate a motivation, generally we're working towards an altruistic motivation, wishing to use our life to benefit other sentient beings, and especially become fully enlightened. Well, especially the attitude of bodhicitta, wishing to become fully enlightened in order to benefit all sentient beings. So it's good always to visualize oneself surrounded by all sentient beings, beginning with your mother and father to your left and right. So we can begin with, you just imagine your mother of this life seated at your immediate left, not whether she's alive or has passed away. And then all of your other female friends and family, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, yeah, spouse, children, friends. So all of your female friends and family to your left. Imagine them at your left and behind you, supporting you. And then beginning with your father of this life, imagine all your male friends and family to your right and behind you. And then imagine those whom you're most prone to become irritated or angry with or disregard, seated directly in front of you, a few meters distant, facing towards you, a little lower down. And then imagine all the other sentient beings of the three realms of the universe of samsara, all in human form, seated all around you, filling all the space. So remember how you're interconnected with all sentient beings from life to life, and how oneself and all other sentient beings are the same in wishing to have well-being and happiness, and wishing to be free from suffering. And then if you like, you can visualize Shakyamuni Buddha or your own spiritual teachers, or any symbol of your own spiritual kind of what you turn to for guidance in the space before you, about the height of your forehead, again, a few meters distant. So now, yeah, so now we'll spend a few minutes. Well, now reflect on what is the meaning of samsara, and how oneself and all other sentient beings are in samsara. So remember from last week, then the uh, kind of essential description of samsara, or definition, is the continuum of repeatedly taking rebirths in contaminated aggregates by the power of afflictive emotions or delusions or karma. So whether you use those words or just use what you remember from last week or your own understanding, and just try to yeah, bring clearly to mind kind of the meaning of samsara, and how that relates to oneself, first of all, and then how it relates to, others, your mother, father, family, friends. So spend a couple minutes thinking of the meaning of samsara and the implications and meaning of being in samsara. And then think about nirvana. Then what is nirvana? Why is it possible to achieve nirvana? How it would be to achieve this for freedom from suffering, freedom from the oceans of samsaric suffering. So nirvana, again, is a cessation that is a complete abandonment of the afflictive obscurations. So because the afflictive obscurations are the fundamental cause giving rise to our rebirth in um, samsara and the contaminated aggregates which give rise to suffering in samsara again and again, then when we completely abandon the afflictive emotions, then we gain a state of peace, which is a sensation of the disturbance of the mind that comes directly, the power of those afflictive emotions, and then also a cessation of the whole process of those afflictive emotions or delusions activating karma, which throws us into rebirth again and again. So that whole process comes to an end, and then we gain the state of peace, liberation, freedom that comes from ending that process. And remember, nirvana is possible because the fundamental cause of samsara is an ignorance, a misunderstanding of the way ourselves and the way other phenomena exist. So take a couple minutes reflecting on some nirvana, your understanding of nirvana. And then finally, recollect, let's get pronunciation, the Four Noble Truths. So how the Four Noble Truths relate to samsara and nirvana. So how the Shakyamuni Buddha first taught the Four Noble Truths in this specific order, the order of contemplation and practice, not the order in which they arise. And how the first two Noble Truths, the truth of suffering and the truth of the cause of suffering, are related to or explain how we are bound in samsara and perpetuate process of samsara, and how the later two, cessation of suffering and the truth of the cessation of suffering and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, explain how to be free from samsara, and then bring to bear any whatever understanding you have of the Four Noble Truths. So again, just spend a couple of minutes reflecting on this kind of overarching teaching of the Buddha, in which all of his other teachings are contained, of the Four Noble Truths, and how that relates to samsara and nirvana. Okay. So that's it for, well, now we'll meditate. Well, we'll recite the prayer of the four measurables. So again, focus your attention on all sentient beings, visualized around you, and recognize how they're the same as you and being trapped in samsara and having the potential for nirvana and the path to nirvana being, the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And then try to generate the aspiration to lead oneself and all sentient beings to a state of freedom, to the state of nirvana, essentially, a state of freedom from samsara. And we can think, for that purpose, and then I'll engage in this session, the second session in this module on samsara and nirvana, or whatever, other virtuous motivation resonates best with you. Generate that. So then we can recite this prayer just once of the four immeasurable thoughts. And then the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. How wonderful it would be for all sentient beings to abide in equanimity, free from attachment to friends and anger towards enemies. May they abide in equanimity. I myself will cause them to abide in equanimity. Please grant me blessings to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be for all sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they have happiness and its causes. I myself will cause them to have these. Please grant me blessings to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they be free from suffering and its causes. I myself will cause them to be free from these. Please grant me blessings to be able to do this. And then how wonderful it would be for all sentient beings to never be separated from the happiness which is totally beyond suffering. May they never be separated from this. I myself will cause them to be never separated from this. Please grant me blessings to be able to do this. And then if you like, you can recite the refuge and bodhicitta prayer together. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My two collections from listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my two collections from explaining the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. From my two collections from explaining the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. Okay, so we'll stop there, the preliminary kind of meditation and prayers. And then, so I thought this session we'll spend mostly looking at these, discussing the truth of suffering from within the Four Noble Truths. Remember the middle scope of Lamrim. That is basically what we're going over in this module. Pretty much covers the Four Noble Truths. Truth of suffering begins with the truth of suffering, then looks at the truth of the cause of suffering, primarily the root delusions or root afflictive emotions. So we'll spend the next two sessions on those. And then doesn't really discuss the truth of cessation expressly very much. But yeah, we'll look at that a bit more in detail later. And then the last, the end of the middle scope is on the path, the nature of the path leading to liberation. We'll look at the outline headings in just a second, but it the path described in the middle scope is the path of the three higher trainings, higher training in morality, higher training in concentration, meditative concentration, and the higher training in wisdom. Yeah. So last week we looked at kind of sort of, yeah, the nature of samsara and nirvana and the Four Noble Truths. It's all kind of general things that have to do with the entire middle scope. So this week we'll focus more in on the truth of suffering, and we'll look at it in great detail. So get ready, because we'll talk about suffering a lot. So there's these three different kind of enumerations, ways of looking at the suffering of samsara in general. So there's a three well, the way we'll discuss it, we'll start with the three sufferings, which are the most important to understand. The suffering of change, and pervasive compounding suffering. Because the most important of everything we'll talk about today, the understanding pervasive compounding suffering is the most important. So in the Lamrim outlines, actually that usually comes right at the end, but because you might be tired and kind of fed up by the end, I thought to put it at the beginning. So we'll look at that first. And then there's the list of the six sufferings of samsara in general, and then the 8 sufferings, especially of humans. So that's what we'll look at today. But before we look at those 3 kind of lists of different sufferings, I wanted to go over the outlines from the Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. Just because it's, well, I wanted to kind of emphasize as you're reading, as you do the required reading for Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, to make kind of special note. And then, so here I put the main headings in like light blue, and then each of the subheadings below those in white. And then the topics that we're covering, have covered last week or covering today in red. So just to kind of point out, because the way sort of the main topics as they're set out in the Discovering Buddhism packet, they don't, it's like they fit in and they come up in the outlines of the Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, but so it's kind of good just to know where and how. But yeah, but looking at these outlines, it kind of gives you an idea of, well, how is all this material we're going through, how is it presented in the middle scope according to the Lama? So here, so we begin with, okay, here I really want to find my pointer. Where is it? Michael, do you know, how do I bring up my pointer? I forgot. I know I've seen it before, but like,
well, I can see your little arrow,
the
cursor, but I don't know how you bring up a pointer in
okay.
however you normally would do it, because whatever you see on your screen, you're showing on your screen, we should be able to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's a way to do it in like in PowerPoint, but I forget. Anyway, as long as you can see my cursor, let's figure it out later. So so the middle scope that we're going through in the Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, it begins with training your mind in the stages of the path shared with the middle scope. So remember, it's shared with the path shared, because actually it's assuming we're aspiring to the Bodhisattva path. So we're not just practicing this kind of path of the middle scope. And so, but we have to practice this as well. Because, I mean, the main point there is because in order to generate profound, deep, profound compassion for other sentient beings, remember, compassion for others, wishing to free others from suffering is the essence of the Bodhisattva path. But in order to generate a very deep, profound kind of compassion for others, one has to deeply and intimately understand all the aspects of one's own experience of suffering, right? And so that means like not just knowing about the painful and painful feelings and unpleasant things we experience in this life, but understanding how even the things that we ordinarily find enjoyable are also in the nature of suffering, and also how this very body and this very state of mind that we that we've been reborn into, that we live in through life, and that we die, and then the process, and then the state of not being in full control of what happens to our continuum of existence after we die, and then how through the force of karma we're thrown into rebirth again. So being in the state of not having control and having, all the things, all the other kinds of sufferings we'll go to. So the more deeply and intimately we understand kind of our own state of this sort of dissatisfying state, the state in which naturally unpleasant and unwanted experiences happen to us again and again, then the more deeply we're familiar with that, then the more profoundly our understanding and empathy for others becomes. So the more deep our compassion comes. So that's why we have to, as someone aspiring to the Bodhisattva path, we also have to practice and contemplate the path shared with beings of the medium scope. So within that, then there's two subheadings: developing thoughts, yearning for liberation. So that's what we'll go over. We went over last week, we'll go over today. And then ascertaining the nature of the path leading to liberation. So from next week, that's what we'll be looking at. So this week, then, developing thoughts, yearning for liberation. So under that, there are two headings: thinking about the general sufferings of samsara and thinking about samsara specific sufferings. So then thinking about the general sufferings of samsara includes what we looked at last week, the general description of what samsara is, what nirvana is, how it's possible to be free from samsara, and then how the Four Noble Truths are involved with that, related to that. And then there's description of the 6 types of suffering, which we'll go over today. And then, so that's thinking about the general suffering of samsara. And then within thinking about samsara specific sufferings, there are 2 headings: thinking about the sufferings of the lower realms, which was already covered in the small scope of Lamrim. I'm not even sure. I don't think it's not even covered much in Discovering Buddhism, I don't think. But so that's about the sufferings of the hells, sufferings of animals, and the sufferings of hungry ghosts, or beings of the lower realms. And then there's thinking about the suffering of the upper realms. So the upper realms includes humans, gods, and demigods. So again, the sufferings of the lower realms was already covered in the small scope, so it's not discussed again here in the middle scope. So rather the focus on the suffering of the upper realms. So that's in that heading, thinking about the sufferings of the upper realms, there are 3: thinking about human suffering, thinking about the sufferings of the demigods, and thinking about the sufferings of the gods. So within those, within thinking about the suffering of humans, there's the 8 types of suffering. So that's what we'll go through today. We won't go over much thinking about the sufferings of demigods and gods. If you want to know more, you can read about it in Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, or other texts. So then you might be thinking, well, what about the 3 types of suffering that you mentioned we're going to go over first? That's actually that's discussed in Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand. It's discussed at the end of this thinking about the suffering of gods, right at the end of this section on developing thoughts of yearning for liberation. It discusses that, and it's just, but like I said, we'll discuss here at the beginning because it's very important. I don't know. So any questions about those outlines? I hope you've been reading Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand. I just sent out, well, anyway, I'll pause. If you have any questions, you can just say so, or use your virtual hand. Anyway, I just extracted those from the text, Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand. So it's all there. Yeah. Okay, if there's no questions about that, then what was I going to say? All right, then we'll go on to, the first of our the three main topics for today. So the three main topics of today are for the three types of suffering, the 6 types of suffering, and the 8 types of suffering. So the 3 types of suffering. Actually, I'm suffering from thirst, so I'm gonna have a drink of water first.
Venerable, if you want to change your pointer, you just right click on the slide and there'll be a drop box that comes down and says pointer options, and you can change it to laser.
All right. Okay. Great. Thanks. Okay. Right. Okay. I like pen. Well, maybe, just to say something general about suffering, because that's what we're speaking about today. Well, first of all, I mean, the term suffering in English, because, we're studying Buddhism. Yeah, we're working with the third language in use always. So, because Buddha, of course, taught in India, ancient India, 2,600 years ago, in well, spoke in a local language, Prakrit probably, or Magadhi. But then and also probably taught in Sanskrit, well, according to the Mahayana presentation. So the word for suffering that was being translated as well, the word in Sanskrit that's being translated as suffering is dukkha, right? So dukkha, and then it's translated in Tibetan as dungel, right? And then from there, translated in English as suffering, generally. But many Buddhist teachers, scholars, they preferred to just use the word dukkha without translating it, because it does carry a little bit different connotation than suffering ordinarily carries in English usage. So dukkha, I mean, and I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so yeah, I'm working more with the Tibetan. But dukkha, yeah, it's said to have more the connotation of like not painful feelings, but a sense of being dissatisfied, kind of dis-ease. That whatever condition we're in, it's not totally satisfying, not quite perfect, or without any disturbance whatsoever. So whether we're sitting, it's never like totally comfortable. Whatever music we're listening to, it's not quite exactly what we want. Whatever food we're eating doesn't taste exactly how we wish, or whatever relationship we have with other people, it's not, it's never, even if in one moment it feels completely satisfying, that doesn't last long. And it gives rise to a kind of dissatisfaction again and again. So this word dukkha, I mean, it covers the whole range, and you'll see as we look at all the different kinds of sufferings today, that the way so yeah, it covers a whole range of from very painful, obviously disturbing experiences of the very worst kind, to the most subtle kind of dis-ease with the situation we're in, and then everything in between. So it covers a whole range of kind of dissatisfying and disturbing experiences on one hand. So then this word dukkha is translated as dukngel in Tibetan. Duk, so the first what do you say, syllable, duk, means kind of ugly or bad, and ngel means it's like difficult. So yeah, so basically again, it's sort of a dissatisfying, disturbing, unpleasant experience. But that, again, that's kind of a misnomer, because there are, even as you'll see, even the pleasant experiences which are in the nature of suffering are fundamentally dissatisfying. So some kinds of suffering appear as what we ordinarily consider pleasurable, enjoyable, or attractive, but actually they're in the nature of suffering because they are produced from afflictive emotions, delusions, and they give rise to further afflictive emotions like attachment. Yeah. Okay. So So the three types of suffering: the suffering of suffering, right? And then the suffering of change, and then pervasive compounding suffering. So just to explain these one by one, um, slides. So I have one slide for each of them. So first, the suffering of suffering is what we ordinarily think of as suffering, painful feelings, right? So we can have painful feelings of the body. So we have hunger, thirst. Oh, actually, that's what I wanted to mention before. I was thinking about is that just thinking about that painful feelings. Yeah, painful feelings of the body, hunger, thirst, pain in the body, tiredness, being too hot, being too cold, all of those. And then painful feelings of the mind, being unhappy, feeling lonely, feeling worried. So the unpleasant feelings that come. So any of our, we feeling something, whether feelings of the body or they're continually present in the body. The mental factor, feeling is a mental factor, and it's an omnipresent mental factor. So that means whatever consciousness, whatever main mind that exists in our continuum, it always is accompanied by a feeling. So we have three different kinds of feelings: painful feelings, pleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. So here, the suffering of suffering is essentially painful feelings. Um, so in Buddhism, suffering is extremely important because, and the whole understanding of the suffering is extremely important because that's the whole purpose of practicing Buddhism, right? If we didn't have suffering, there'd be no need for Buddha to have taught anything. There'd be no path. There'd be no need for, religion. There'd be no need for any spiritual teachings if we didn't have any problems. Essentially, all spiritual teachings of whatever religion, then they're all addressing problems that we have. That's the whole point of the way they exist, the reason they exist. And in the Buddhist view, more fundamentally, the reason we do anything is either being motivated by the wish to be free from suffering or motivated by the wish to have happiness and well-being. So just as, suffering encompasses all kinds of dissatisfying experiences which we don't want, which we want to be free from, then happiness in that context, it indicates any satisfying, state of well-being which we want, a pleasant um, object, a pleasant experience that we want. So in the Buddhist view, then all of our actions, from drinking a glass of water to turning on our phone to going for a walk to laying down to sleep at night, they're all motivated by a fundamental wish, a fundamental drive to have well-being and happiness and to be free from suffering. And that's the case for humans. That's the case for devas and gods. That's the case for animals down to the tiniest single-celled organism. It's the case for hell beings, ghosts, and whoever. Any sentient being that exists is fundamentally driven by this wish to be free from suffering. And in that case, we're usually talking about the suffering, painful feelings, and have pleasant feelings. So, but the suffering of suffering, so anytime we have a painful feeling, painful thought, whether it's in our mind or in our body, it's the suffering of suffering. So an analogy for the suffering is it's like the feeling from rubbing salt on an open wound. So imagine we have an open wound and then we rub salt in it, then painful feelings arise, just stinging and pain arises. So that's like the suffering of suffering. So this analogy of the open wound we'll use through all three of these three types of suffering. So the suffering of suffering is like rubbing salt or some other irritant in an open wound. And that is painful feelings. And then where does it exist in samsara? It exists in the desire realm. So the desire realm in samsara, it consists of the realms of humans and then the realm of animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. So it's where as opposed to, so there's the form realm and the formless realm. So the form and formless realm are realms that one achieves through generating a level of meditative concentration and then taking rebirth through the force of that. So once one achieves a single point in concentration, or actually calm abiding, and then the different dhyanas, there are 4 jhanas or meditative concentrations. So once one achieves uh, a single point in, or, yeah, single point in concentration, and then on the basis of that achieves calm abiding, the ability to single-pointedly focus one's mind on an object of placement meditation without any distraction at all for 4 hours effortlessly, for 4 hours or more. Anyway, and then gives rise to this it's called calm abiding. It's, yeah, it's kind of a base state of, very good meditative concentration. And then on the basis of that, one can generate this, by increasing the power of that concentration, one generates the 4 concentrations of the form realm, and then there's 4 meditative concentrations that are more subtle of the formless realm. So those concentrations of, once one achieve, if one has a rebirth through the force of those concentrations of the form and formless realm, one in those realms, one doesn't experience any painful feelings. One only has pleasant or neutral feelings. So this painful feelings, the suffering of suffering, are only experienced in the desire realm. So we're like, right now we're in the desire realm. Why? Because our kind of mentality, the way we engage with the world, the way we operate, is mainly shaped by attachment, by desire, by the wish to have pleasant sensations. Um, so that's what's thrown us into this rebirth, and that's kind of the predominant force propelling us to do things, is our attachment to objects of pleasure. So suffering only exists in the desire realm. And then, and this is one that can also be recognized by animals as being in the nature of suffering, right? So even, of course, when we have painful feelings, we realize, yeah, that's bad. It's something I don't want. That's kind of a form of suffering, a form of dissatisfaction. I don't like it. I want to be free from that. As humans, we easily recognize. But even animals, dogs and cats, when they have hunger and thirst, when they're being threatened by, an opponent or predator, then they recognize that as kind of suffering. When they're, especially mammals, like when they're, like a mother, like cat, for example, a cat or dog, when they have a litter of kittens or pups, and then they lose one from the litter, they don't know where it is, then you can see it, they suffer as a result. They have painful feelings, the fear of not knowing where my offspring is, what's happened to them. So this suffering of suffering, whether physical suffering or mental suffering, mental feelings of pain, then animals also recognize those. So as opposed to the next, so here's the suffering of change, is the next one. So this one's more difficult to recognize. Animals cannot recognize it as being in the nature of suffering, but humans can. So what is it? First of all, it's contaminated pleasant feelings. So basically here the idea is that most, well, most pleasant feelings that we have, they're unstable. They don't last long. And actually they're not in the nature of bringing enjoyment and bringing us satisfaction and pleasure. And how can we see that? Because the longer we engage in the actions which gave rise to those pleasant feelings, if they were in the nature of, so if actions which give rise to pleasant feelings, for example, now I was thirsty and I just had a drink of water. I'm going to again because I'm thirsty again. But if just drinking water was in the nature of, so there is some satisfaction when you're thirsty, your mouth is dry or something. Then there's some satisfaction, some relief that comes from drinking water. But if just like sipping on water was in the nature of bringing pleasure, bringing pleasant experience, bringing enjoyment and satisfaction, then the longer we sip on water and the more, if we just continually sip on water, then that should just bring more and more and more pleasure. But that's not the case. If we just keep sipping on water, before long we'll be kind of tired of doing it. And then we start to experience the pleasure of the pain, the dissatisfaction, or the suffering of just sipping on water. So that's the idea here, is that most of the pleasures we experience, they're not in the nature, and the things which give rise to those pleasures, they're not in the nature of bringing us happiness and well-being, but rather they're in the nature of suffering. We can see that because the longer we do them, the longer we engage, the longer we experience them, their suffering nature becomes more and more manifest until they give rise to suffering of suffering. So, there's a big question, though, that we should ask. Is every pleasant experience we have in the nature of suffering? Every pleasant experience we have, is it the suffering of change or not? So we can come back to that. But let me give some other examples first. So classic examples given in the Lama text are like sitting, like we're all sitting now. So if we're standing or walking for a long time, then we get tired of standing. The muscles to support us standing become tired. The joints become uncomfortable, or it becomes uncomfortable to stand for a long time. If you've ever been in like a funeral or a wedding or something, you kind of know that, or church, or I don't know, waiting in a line. So anyway, we all know what it feels like to be standing for too long. So then when we sit down, it's a relief, right? So there's a pleasure of sitting, which I hope you're still experiencing now, although I might already be giving rise to suffering. I'm not sure. It's been almost an hour. So when we first sit down, there's a pleasant feeling of sitting. But then again, if sitting was if it was in the nature of pleasure, then the longer we sit, the more pleasure we should have. Just like, fire is in the nature of hot and burning. So the more fire you have, the more hot burning you have. It never becomes like cold, right? Because its nature is just hot and burning. So the idea is that actually sitting is in the nature of suffering. So why do we experience, when we're tired of standing, and when we sit down, why do we experience pleasure? What we're actually experiencing is the relief from the intense pleasure of standing. So because we've been standing for a long time, then the nature of standing being in the nature of suffering, or standing's standing's kind of being in the nature of suffering has become very manifest, right? So we're experiencing the suffering of standing. So when we sit down, we experience the relief from that. So relative to being relieved from that what had become kind of intense suffering of standing, then the experience of sitting feels very pleasant. So it's a relative thing. So in relation to the relief of that greater suffering, then the experience of sitting itself appears as pleasurable, and we have a pleasant feeling of sitting. But the idea is that actually that sensations of sitting are in the nature of suffering, and the longer we sit, the more that becomes manifest, the more that becomes obvious. So the longer we sit for a very long time, then what had been pleasant feelings, gradually they're transformed into unpleasant feelings, into the suffering of suffering. And then similar with like, eating food versus not eating food, or standing in the shade versus standing in the sun. Like if you're hot and you go to stand in the shade, then gradually, you get too cold. Although that's not always the case. Sometimes it's a very hot day and it's just pleasant in the shade, and then it doesn't become suffering in the shade. But if you stand in the shade on a cool day and then become too cold, then you get too cold, then you go stand in the sun again. Or if you're too full of eating food, then you want to not eat for a while. So then just not eating, feeling pleasant. But then if you don't eat for too long, you become hungry and thirsty. So then you need to eat again. But then if you continue eating for too long, that itself becomes a suffering. And then also with, those are all kind of gross examples, but in more subtle way, like in our interpersonal relationships with others. I mean, we all know from having relationships with siblings or parents or friends or partners that it's difficult to maintain. It's not easy to maintain like cordial, harmonious relationships. Like even when we're getting along very well with someone at 1 hour or one day, then eventually some point of disagreement arises, and we don't get along well with them in that moment, and we have to find a way to resolve that kind of disagreement. So it's like relationships with others, even when we have a very good friend, and it at some points it seems like, oh, we're going to be very close and mutually understanding of each other, supportive of each other forever. Like that rarely, probably never really lasts. Eventually there's some disagreement, some conflict arises, and either we part ways or we work through that and find a way to kind of carry on, and probably feel closer, more understanding of one another as a result. But even that like doesn't last. Um, so that's the idea of this suffering of change. And this one is much more difficult to understand, um, and much more, yeah, complex than the previous suffering of suffering. So contaminated. So in short, it's contaminated pleasant feelings. So the idea is that why are the pleasant feelings we experience, why are they contaminated? Because they've arisen through the force of karma and afflictive emotions. Therefore, they're in the nature of disturbance. I mean, afflictive emotions or delusions are by definition things that, anger and attachment, jealousy, arrogant pride are quite easy to see how when they arise in our continuum, when they arise in our mind, in that very moment, they disturb the mind. So their nature is, and also their fundamental root is this ignorance, a misunderstanding of the way we and other things exist by grasping at things as being independently existing from their own side. So because then this body that we experience and most of the minds, most of the experiences we have are products of, they've arisen by the power of these afflictive emotions, excuse me, then their very nature is to be disturbing, right? So they're not things that bring lasting satisfaction. So if we want lasting satisfaction, um, we need to generate wisdom, which correctly understands how, the nature of reality. And then out of that wisdom, give rise to virtuous minds of, patience, kindness, compassion, love. And then, eventually when our whole, our body, um, our mind, our whole environment, our whole experience is produced by the power of those, of wisdom, kindness, empathy, compassion, generosity, patience, then we'll experience kind of infinite pleasure. Things that do give rise to pleasure more and more and more, the more you focus on them. Mm. So when I posed the question earlier, is it the case that every pleasant experience we have is in the nature of suffering that eventually gives rise to to un, to pain? Then the best, if we want to look for exceptions. What pleasant experience do we have that, if the more we engage in that activity, just the more pleasure we would feel? So I'll leave you with that question for a minute. Um, so then the rest of the characteristics here. So the suffering of change is like the feelings from pouring cool water on an open wound. So again, imagine we have an open wound, but when we pour cool water or we rub some kind of balm into it, some kind of like cream, then we feel relief, temporary relief. So that's like suffering of change. But if we keep pouring cool water on it or keep rubbing that balm on it like ridiculously long time, then eventually it gives rise to suffering again, painful feelings again. So it's like that. It's kind of temporary relief from more dire sufferings. And then this kind of the suffering of change exists in the desire realm. remember among hell beings, maybe just a little bit. Hungry ghosts, animals, definitely. Humans, of course, this is the one we crave after, we long for. And then also in the form realm, up to the third concentration. So remember, in the form realm, this is realm that one can take rebirth into the force of single point of concentration, then up to the third concentration, have pleasant feelings. From that point on, they recognize that pleasant feelings also cause subtle disturbance in the mind, and they just have neutral feelings, which are more peaceful. And then it's something also it's recognized by non-Buddhists. So also non-Buddhists recognize this. So here we're primarily referring to, like, mystics, yogis in other religious traditions, whether it be Hindu, Islam, Christian. Then there are many others who recognize that this kind of the suffering of change, these contaminated pleasant feelings are also fundamentally dissatisfying, and they seek a state of kind of equanimity and peace that's transcended these contaminated pleasant feelings. So I know that one's a little difficult to understand. So any questions there about either of those two, suffering of suffering or suffering of change? No? Okay. Then let's take a... So could any of you think of good candidates for something that is pleasurable we experience that's not in the nature of suffering? That's not the suffering of change. It'd be kind of depressing if there isn't anything.
One thing that popped into my mind
Many
was,
people find this topic a bit depressing. Yes? Was it Corey?
yes, the first thing that popped to mind and is memories, so reminiscence of things that were joyful or were pleasant.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one. Memories. Yeah, but then, so the way to check then is to think, well, imagine, what if we just kept thinking of those memories?
Mm.
Well, especially, and I mean, if we think of joyful memories, we usually think of one for a while, then think of another one and think of another one. Right? Like, what if you were just keep thinking of the same one? You were just stuck thinking of the same joyful memory again and again and again. Then, yeah, you could imagine it might become, imagine that if you really got just stuck on thinking, you couldn't stop thinking of that same, what was joyful memory, it'd probably become unpleasant after a while.
In psychology,
imagine it might.
that would be ruminating. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be kind of like ruminating. Yeah. Other candidates?
Everything I thought of, I thought the same kind of thing. If I started ruminating on them, if I started fixating on them, they go from something that's pleasurable to something where I am again stuck. I couldn't think of anything where I could care about something so much and forever where I would not get stuck, where I didn't have the potential to be stuck. And on any of them, I don't have to be stuck.
Yeah. But what about, well, just try to think more broadly, like completely different, other pleasurable. I mean, think of all the different kind of pleasurable experiences we have in life. I mean, because many people find this whole idea quite shocking, that all of those are in the nature of suffering. Right? So is that really the case? I mean, that's what we have to check. I mean, well, because remember, the Buddhist main point here is that, well, because most of the pleasurable experience that we have, if we keep engaging the activities that give rise to those, eventually one, they're just temporary, they don't last long. And then two, if we keep engaging in the very same kind of activity that gave rise to them, that eventually turns into something unpleasant. I don't know, what's another good candidate maybe for something that seems like it just gives pleasure more and more and more?
Meditation.
Yeah, exactly. Good one. Yeah.
Except the legs are not happy after about 45 minutes.
Yeah, same here. No, but it's true. That is one of the better candidates. And meditation on what? Like, what's your favorite meditation? I mean, you don't have to tell me seriously, but
Oh, right. Yeah.
it's too personal. But what's a kind of meditation you really enjoy? What's your name? Yeah, you. Yeah.
Uh, I have lots of meditations I enjoy. I do a lot of chakra stuff, and I do a lot of Vajrasattva and Shakyamuni.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, but that kind of thing, like you meditate, like a meditation you really enjoy. Like yeah, well, I don't know. I think of meditation on loving kindness, meditation on emptiness. If you didn't
Yes.
have the physical discomfort, just the mental if you just had kind of unhindered mental experience, um there's a possible, that activity of, meditating on loving kindness, giving rise to loving kindness, or being absorbed in the understanding of emptiness.
Yeah.
Could that go on and on and on and just give more and more pleasure? I think that's the best candidate, actually.
Yeah.
um but another one is like, I think one of the most powerful, like pleasant experiences many people have in their life is like love for their children. Like, I'm not a parent, I don't have children, but I've heard from many parents that the kind of selfless love one has for one's children is something that, you know, why are you laughing?
I'm sorry, because I'm a mom, and recently, a year
Yeah,
ago, my daughter stopped talking to me.
yeah, yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, exactly.
And so that is part of my meditation, is like watching my attachments and my
Mhm.
emotions. And the last 4 months, I'm pretty good with the equanimity, and I'm like, I'm not talking to her, and I'm letting her have her space. And the emptiness meditations and just the love help.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. So I don't have to say
Yeah.
much more about why that's not such a good candidate than that one. Um, but I mean, but if you can isolate, just distill just the love aspect, yeah, independent of the person, then maybe, yeah. I mean, that's what you do when you meditate on love. You try to distill that attitude, independent of expectation from anyone. Anyway, yeah, that's kind of one way to think about this suffering of change. And we have to go through the others, otherwise we're going to run out of time. But one other doubt that always comes up with regard to the suffering of change is the idea. I mean, because we do have resistance to thinking most of the pleasant experiences we have are in the nature of suffering. So there's the idea, well, it seems like the problem is, that's being pointed out in the suffering of change is not so much that pleasant experiences are in the nature of suffering, but that if we do anything for too long, that's just stupid, right? That we should just keep jumping around. Of course, we're not going to keep eating the same food like, ad nauseum, or sitting in one place, or staying in one place, or being with one person. So to have happiness, we just have to keep changing what we do. But it's kind of like, that's the whole point. That's exactly right. That is the right strategy, to keep changing the position physically we're in, keep changing what we're doing. But the whole point is like, well, why do we have to do that? Why can't we just abide in one state and be totally like at ease? That is the nature. That's because we're in the nature of suffering, right? That's why we have to keep changing. So that's what's being pointed out here in this suffering of change, is that the nature of this. I mean, we're in samsara. The nature of the samsara state we're in is that we have to always keep doing something else just to maintain a state of comfort. Because if we don't, whatever state we're in, it's going to give rise to more suffering. So that itself shows that samsara is in the nature of suffering. And samsara is, remember, it's not like some place we're in. It's this contaminated body and kind of mental condition that, and sort of set of experiences and environment that has been produced by afflictive emotions and karma. So that brings us well to the next one, the pervasive compounding suffering, right? So pervasive compounding suffering are essentially neutral feelings. So again, with regard to our analogy of the wound, then it's like the feeling of having an open wound, which is neither affected by an irritant or a balm. So remember, if we have an open wound and we put an irritant like salt on it, it gives rise to painful feelings. If we put like something soothing on it, like cool water or a balm, it gives rise to pleasant feelings, which don't last. But just the fact of having an open wound is like, it's like just by having an open wound, the potential for painful or fundamentally dissatisfying pleasant experiences, the potential for those to arise is there, right? So as long as we have that open wound, then eventually when it meets with some conditions, it's going to give rise to painful experiences. When it meets with other conditions, it's going to produce, fundamentally unsatisfying, pleasant experiences. So the contaminated neutral feelings that we have, even though when we have just neutral feelings, we're just relaxed, just sitting quietly, not giving rise to attachment and not feeling disturbed. Just the neutral feelings of body and mind themselves are also in the nature of suffering, because they're just accompanying the state whereby when of being in samsara, of having this contaminated aggregates, whereby when we meet with certain conditions, our negative karma will be activated and will have unpleasant experiences. When we meet with other conditions, our contaminated virtuous karma will be activated and will have pleasant experiences which are unstable and which gradually, they don't last and gradually give rise to suffering again. So it's basically the state of being, these pleasant feelings that pervade all of samsara. So they exist so the C here, they exist in all realms of samsara. So where do they exist? They exist from the lowest hells, animals, humans, and then up to the upper realms, the form realm, and then even up to the formless realm. So the very peak of samsara. So every being in samsara, they have these contaminated and neutral feelings. Right? So they have pervasive. So that's why it's called pervasive, because it pervades or is spread through all the realms of samsara as opposed to the others. And it's called compounding suffering, both because, well, on one reason, because it's been produced by karma and afflictive emotions, and on more pointedly, because or more significantly, because it is a condition for giving rise to future suffering. So it's compounding. So even those neutral feelings themselves, they, because they're in the nature of suffering, then they serve to give rise to future disturbing emotions, attachment, anger, and painful feelings. So because that's just their nature, right? So that's why it's called compounding suffering. It compounds or produces or it serves as a condition for future suffering. So even though we don't experience painful feelings or pleasant feelings in that moment, it's a condition for future ones to arise. And only Buddhists recognize this one. So this is a very Buddhist thing to say, maybe a little biased, but the idea here is that practitioners in other religious traditions or spiritual traditions don't accurately identify the fundamental cause of samsara. So to identify, something as pervasive compounding suffering means that well, maybe I should back up a little bit. So imagine in ancient India, in the context of India, ancient India, that among different spiritual practitioners, generally the non-Buddhist, so think about Shakyamuni Buddha even. Shakyamuni Buddha, before he became enlightened under the Bodhi tree, he studied and practiced under two Hindu teachers of different traditions. And they taught him that the way to achieve liberation was to achieve this very deep states of single-pointed meditative concentration, whereby one can eliminate all painful feelings, one can eliminate all pleasant feelings, and one just abides in a very stable state where you only experience neutral feelings. So and they considered that as having been the achievement of nirvana. So in ancient India, and they're typical of these non-Buddhist schools, that they in India, Hindu schools, that they consider the different rebirths in the form or formless realm through the power of meditative concentration, where one can abide in just having neutral feelings, an undisturbed state of kind of neutral experience for, years, many years, eons, that they consider that having to be nirvana. Whereas in that state, one is not actually free from, because as long as one hasn't identified the ignorance, which is the root of samsara, and eliminated that with wisdom, then one is still under the control of karma. So one can create the karma to abide in this neutral state for many years. But when the karma to abide in that state becomes exhausted, then through the force of other karma, one takes rebirth again in lower realms, samsara. So, so it's said that by Buddhists, of course, that only Buddhists recognize this ignorance, grasping at things as not being interdependently arising. Right. So the fundamental wisdom in Buddhism that frees us from samsara is recognizing that us and all other phenomena are interdependently arising through the forces of causes and conditions, arising in dependence upon multiple parts, which are not the part possessor, and especially arising in dependence upon the act of mental imputation, labeling this as this, that as that, and thereby things come into existence. So whereas no other religious spiritual tradition, at least obviously teaches this kind of dependent arising, which frees one from samsara. So and thereby doesn't recognize the this fundamental ignorance as a root of samsara, and thereby doesn't recognize that these neutral feelings, even themselves, are in the nature of suffering. So for that reason, only Buddhists. That was a little, yeah, if you don't get all of that now, don't worry about it. We'll come back to it again later, but it's a little deep. So this is the most difficult to understand. Animals, of course, can't understand. Most humans don't understand. Yeah, it kind of requires some exposure to the Buddhist teachings to get a good understanding of. But this is the one to actually generate renunciation. This is the one to focus on, that pervasive compounding suffering. We have to understand how the contaminated body and mind we dwell in now are in the nature of suffering, and even neutral feelings are in the nature of suffering, to really generate a wish to be free from samsara. Okay. So we'll come back to that. So now I'll look through, okay, so now I have two long lists to go through. I'll just go through quickly, and then if you want to know more, you can read, in the different required readings, especially Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand. And then I want to spend a bit more time on the last of the 8. Okay, so the 6 types of suffering, thinking about, so this is thinking about the general sufferings of samsara. So first, the bane of uncertainty. That's the way it's translated in the translation of Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand we're using. But another way to translate it is like the fault of uncertainty, basically. So it means basically in samsara, like nothing we have is certain. Even we're alive now, it's not certain we'll be alive tomorrow. Even, you know, you know, our daughter talks to us today, it's not sure she'll talk to us tomorrow. Even though we have a home now, it's not sure we're going to have it tomorrow. Even though the country we're in is at peace now, it's not sure, you know, Russia is going to attack it like tomorrow or something. You know, think about nuclear weapons. Like we could all be destroyed by nuclear weapons like tomorrow. So, and then even like the food we're eating is so delicious now. It's not sure there's not like, I don't know, some giardia in it or something, then it's gonna make us sick, right? So there's no certainty in samsara. Whatever we enjoy in samsara, it's not certain it's going to last, and it's not certain it's yeah, not going to harm us. So that's that. The bane of being dissatisfied, or the fault of insatiability. It's another way of translating that. I took that. So some of these translations I take from, I mean, if you want to know about all these things in much more detail, read Lama Tsongkhapa's The Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, Lamrim Chenmo. It's more detailed. But the fault of insatiability, yeah, so there's a quote from Sutra. O king, if a man were to receive all celestial pleasures there be, all noble human pleasures there be, it would not be enough. He would seek even more. So yeah, whatever, the idea is that whatever pleasurable things we have, it's never really enough. We always want something more, something new. So we can see that in terms of, you know, wealth, however much money we have. So it's a sense we could use more. Whatever, you know, good friends we have, eventually feel like, you know, could use more. Whatever, you know, food we have, you know, the taste gets old and then we want something different. Always looking for a new restaurant. So this is how advertisers, you know, keep us buying, is to recognize this human nature that we have to not be satisfied with what we have, and always crave something new, something different, something more. No matter how many places we've been, you know, we see a picture of another place and think, oh, I'd like to go there. So there's the bane of being dissatisfied or being insatiable, having insatiable craving. So the antidote to that is practicing contentment and having few desires. So Nagarjuna, in his letter to a friend, says, always be content. If you know contentment, though you have no property, you have the purest wealth. So think of someone who's very wealthy, but if they don't have contentment with what they have, then they just crave more and more, and that, you know, that brings like suffering to the mind. Then all the wealth they have, it's not really doing them any good to bring them real satisfaction and happiness. Whereas even if we have this kind of minimalistic view, even if we have very, very few possessions, we just have a simple place to live, you know, clothes just to protect our body, keep us warm, to cover our body, enough food just to sustain the body, and we feel like, oh, I don't need anything more than that. Then that contentment is a kind of wealth that even, you know, someone with millions of dollars and many homes, they don't have. Then there is the bane of repeatedly leaving bodies. So no matter how good things go for us in this life, no matter what a good body, what a great family, you know, what good job, meaningful work, eventually we die. We have to leave this body at the time of death. And that's a kind of, as long as we're in samsara, that's what will happen to us. So, I mean, implicitly a big question comes, which probably comes for many of us, is, well, is it really possible to achieve a state in which we don't die anymore? Is that possible or not? Like, we have to seriously ask that question. Usually we don't even consider that as a possibility, but that's kind of hiding, that question is in the background here. So the bane of repeatedly leaving bodies, because if it's like from a stoic way of looking at it, if it's inevitable that we're going to experience death again and again and again, then there's no point like griping about it, right? We should just accept it, right? But the Buddhist idea is, well, no, death is just something, it's a result of birth through the force of karma and afflictive emotions. So it's not something inevitable. It's something we've always experienced in samsara until now, but it's not something we inevitably always experience in the future. Death itself is a product of causes and conditions. So if we eliminate the causes and conditions for a contaminated birth, then we eliminate the cause for death. So this is what we'll talk about in the 12 links of dependent arising, or a little later in this module. But for now, just recognize one fault of samsara is repeatedly leaving bodies, means essentially dying, being separated from this body again and again. Then the bane of being conceived and born over again and again. So yeah, not only we have to leave this body, but then if we take rebirth, as a dog, our stream of consciousness is thrown into the womb of our dog mother. We have to dwell in the womb and then be delivered from there. Or even if we're born as a hungry ghost, we're born as this kind of incredibly hungry, like craving kind of being somewhere, floating around, hassling people. Or if we're born as a human, then, can you imagine you all of a sudden, if you're like 1 month old again, you can't talk, nobody knows what in the world you want. You just have to cry when you get hungry. You have to start learning the alphabet and like mathematic tables like all over again. Like what a hassle. So there's that, the bane of being conceived and born over all again, over and over again. So Nagarjuna's letter to a friend says, if you counted all your mothers with juniper berries sized balls of earth. So if you take the whole earth and kind of make into juniper balls like the size of marbles or juniper berries, the earth would be not be enough to count the number of mothers you've had in the past, instead of ridding yourself of sorrow. So basically the number of rebirths we've had in the past is infinite. So, you have time and again in hell drunk so much boiling molten brass, even the water in the oceans would not equal it. So he's saying basically our past lives, rebirths and samsara, and all the sufferings that we've experienced in the past in samsara are completely infinite. So if we want to just carry on doing that, then just don't do anything. Carry on as you are. But if we want to bring that whole process to an end, then yeah, meditate on the nature of samsara while we have this chance. We have the intelligence of being human. We've met the Buddhist teachings. We have some interest. So we have an opportunity to understand like what's going on. Why do things happen to us in this life? Why are we born? What's going to happen when we die? And how to be free from this whole process. So then the bane of moving from high to low over and over again. So from the transmission Vinaya Sutra, it says all collections end up running out. All the high end up falling, meeting ends in separation, living ends in death. Yeah. So how many people, when they have, a high position, like I don't know, CEO of, Silicon Bank? Where are they now? Probably still very wealthy somewhere, just retiring. But how many people they have a very high position and then fall, into disrepute? They're very wealthy, they lose their wealth. Have a very kind, loving family, and then maybe the parents die, and then they all argue about the inheritance, and then never want to speak to each other or see each other again. Or we're very healthy and then suddenly get sick. And then even if none of those things befall us in this life, eventually, no matter how fortunate we are, life ends in death. So that's kind of the ultimate falling out of a fortunate state. So whatever fortunate state we're in, apart from like Dharma practice, it's not stable. And there's a danger that we fall out of it, we lose it, as long as we're in samsara. Or of course, the state of nirvana, state of enlightenment, is a stable state of well-being. So then the bane of having no companions, from Shantideva's A Way of the Bodhisattva, alone we're born, alone we come into the world, and when we die, alone we pass away. No one shares our fate and none of our suffering. What need do I have of friends who hinder me, or meddlesome friends? So the idea is that, we have companions in this life, but mostly they're not so trustworthy, so reliable. What do they really help us to relieve our suffering? Definitely some friends do. There's no question. We can have good friendships and supportive friends. But another question, if I'm really like incapacitated, will they really be there to help me or not? And then even if they are, we're going to die alone eventually. At the time of death, we, gradually we lose our ability to see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think clearly, and we're just die, with our own karmic appearance. So in samsara, again and again, we're separated from the companions we have, and we take rebirth alone, again and again. So those are the 6 types of sufferings. So now the 8 types of sufferings. So these are described as 8 types of sufferings of humans, but they apply to many other beings in samsara. So there's the suffering of birth. So why is birth called suffering? Yeah, usually we don't really think about in detail, but there's a detailed description here of, what it's like to, when we're born into the womb. It's like, actually, what helps me kind of think that this might be real is if you read near-death experiences, read about different people's accounts of near-death experiences. I forget who are the main researchers. Well, Pim van Lommel is one of the older researchers, and now Sam Parnia is one current researcher. But it's interesting. Look at different psychologists, or Pim van Lommel is a cardiologist, but people who do interviews with people who report having, when their heart stopped, or they're suffocated or whatever, and then they're revived so at that period when they're clinically dead. Many people have these very powerful experiences, and some see their mental continuum, which they identify as their self, of being separated from their body, and then see their body like from hovering in space above or something. But what was I saying that? Oh, I know in several cases of near-death experiences I've read, because many people, they encounter like a all-pervasive kind of light and sense of all-pervading loving being or loving presence. And they feel, especially if they've been sick for a long time, they feel liberated from like the kind of heavy discomfort of their physical body. But then some, when they are revived, some describe this experience of, it's like entering their body again, and it being very unpleasant, right? It's like jumping into like cold, thick water or something. So I don't know, you can imagine you're like a bardo being. You're just kind of pure consciousness kind of floating around in space, and then suddenly your consciousness is conjoined with like, sperm and egg cells of your parents at the time of conception, conjoined with this physical medium. And then you're in this dark womb, and you're very fragile. The body's extremely fragile, from the time of conception. So when your mother drinks cold liquid, you feel you feel freezing cold. Drink hot liquid, you feel extremely hot. And then, imagine being delivered from the womb. Like if it's painful for the mother, how painful it must be for the infant. And then as an infant, you're again unable to express your wishes, desires. Then pain of hunger is extremely strong, and so forth. So there's all kinds of sufferings that go with birth. And then the suffering of aging. You get more and more pains in your body. Your radiance declines, your mental faculties decline, become forgetful. People don't want to be around you. They want to put you away in an old age home. Find it difficult to focus on things, and so forth and so on. So here from the Great Play Sutra, it says, age makes a beautiful body ugly. Age takes radiance. Age takes strength. We lose our physical strength and radiance. Age takes happiness. Age humiliates. So yeah, for many people, become, especially get dementia. If you have dementia, then yeah, become full of fear and confusion and unknowing. Age humiliates. Then people who maybe you do foolish things, drool or say inappropriate things, or can't stand up, can't sit down. You feel kind of whereas you used to be able to deport yourself in a way that would command respect. Can't do that anymore. Feel humiliated. And gradually age kills and robs of the complexion. Yeah, so it leads to death. And then, okay, so there's birth, aging, sickness, and death here. The suffering of illness, I don't have to say much about. From the Great Place Sutra, in the dead of winter, great winds and falls of snow rob grass, trees, forest, and shrubs of brilliance. Sickness likewise robs beings of their brilliance, and their bodies' strength and faculties decline. So yeah, just think about different experience of sickness, and the suffering of death. Time makes for death, leaving and leaving in death. Forever you are separated from dear and pleasant people. They will not come back. There will be no reunion. How like falling leaves or the flow of a river. So this is really, I think, there's all kinds of suffering to go with death, from, just the fear of death occurring before it happens. Then as we're dying, if we're confused about what's happening, not wanting to leave maybe our body, not wanting to leave our identity of that life, not wanting to leave behind, our children or family or possessions, but having no power to stop it, just being carried away. And then maybe one of the most tragic is, you think of, all the wonderful things we experience in this life, especially the relationships with, teachers, friends, being separated from those and never meeting those people again, ever in that form. Yeah, that's one of the most tragic things, I think, in samsara. So again, we have to think, is that inevitable to always be like that? If we were enlightened, then it's like we would be with everybody all the time. And all our enlightened companions, of course, would never be separated from. So yeah, so suffering of death. And then the suffering of being separated from what is pleasant. So yeah, again, whatever we enjoy doesn't last. Eventually we're separated from it, whether it be good food, nice place to stay, a nice state of, nice meditation session, doesn't last. Nice physical experience. Yeah, good friends. They're separated now. Even at a teaching like with His Holiness Dalai Lama, just kind of enjoying so much. Eventually we have to part ways, go our own way. The suffering of meeting with what is unpleasant. And then unpleasant things happen to us again and again. No matter what we do, where we stay, we again and again will meet unpleasant people. Sickness happens, age happens, old age. The weather turns, kind of misfortunes befall us. Wherever we are in samsara, eventually we meet with what is unpleasant, or die and then take rebirth, the force of a non-virtuous karma. And then the suffering of seeing the things we desire, seeking the things we desire, but not finding them. So it means like craving after things, seeking to acquire or be with, experience things we like, and not being satisfied, not being able to get what we want, short. So Aryadeva in his 400 verses says, the high have mental suffering. So those who are like wealthy, powerful, famous, they have a lot of mental suffering. Especially those who are wealthy, they don't have, physical suffering. They have comfortable clothes, comfortable, houses to stay in, plenty of food and drink. So that's not a problem. And, good medical care. For them, that's not a problem. But think, all the mental suffering they have. Think of like Donald Trump, so much wealth, power, but all these court cases against him, people attacking his reputation. So many wealthy people, they have to worry about, the more possessions we have, the more we have to worry about, like, how to protect them, how to keep track of them, how to not let them get stolen or misused. The more power we have, the more we have to think about how to use it and not to lose it. The more people are responsible for how to deal with all those people. Think about all the headaches like Elon Musk must have. You have a great huge spaceship, but then you launch it and it blows up in the sky. Then you have to build it all over again. So many sufferings like that. So the high have mental suffering. The ordinary have physical suffering. It means the ordinary. So this is again from like 2,000 years ago in India. It was ordinary people that are like farmers and shepherds. So much physical suffering. These days, not quite like that, but think of the people with less money. Then they have suffering worrying about how to pay for the rent, how to pay, what if I get sick, how to pay for health insurance, medical bills, auto insurance, car payments, whatever, children's college, all those things. So these two sufferings conquer the world every single day. So in short, he's saying, we seek happiness, but it eludes us. We have to continually do things again and again and again to try to find lasting satisfaction. But as long as we're in samsara, we can't. There's a saying in Tibet, there's no suffering in samsara, even the size of a needle point. Right? So the point of a needle is something very small. In samsara, there's no lasting happiness, even that small bit of lasting happiness. And then finally, the one I wanted to speak about a bit, because it's very much related to the pervasive compounding suffering, is the eighth, the suffering of the 5 appropriate aggregates. So this just means that the 5 appropriate aggregates, you remember the aggregates I mentioned before? What are the 5 aggregates? Can you remember? What's the first? The first one's easy. Anybody know?
Isn't it form?
Yes, exactly. The form aggregate, which just means our body.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone know the second? It's
Second
feeling.
one.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other 4 are all mental. They're all
The second one is
basically
sensation.
mental. So the second was feeling. The third is discrimination, thinking like this is this, this is that. Feeling, of course, means pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, neutral feelings. And then discrimination, thinking, this is this is that. This is good, this is bad. This is up, this is down. And then the fourth is a kind of catch-all category. It's all the other mental factors, all other kinds of consciousness that are not included in feeling, discrimination, and then the fifth, consciousness. So the fifth is consciousness. The fifth aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness. It mainly means the mental consciousness, but also includes the other 5 main minds of eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, the 5 sense consciousness. So in short, you can subsume into just body and mind. In short, it's like our body and mind. This body and mind, the way they exist now, are in the nature of suffering. That's what it's saying. The suffering of the 5 appropriate aggregates. They're vessels for future suffering, because on the basis of having this body, then we crave, when we're thirsty, we crave drink, or we crave food, drink, so forth. I'll be done in just 5 minutes. Someone else has to use the office. And we give rise to, craving for, sexual contact, other, pleasant physical experiences, and then also this body's in the nature to give rise to sickness and ultimately death. So it's a vessel for few, and then the mind as well is in the nature, because it's our mind the way it exists now. It's habituated to anger, attachment, selfishness, and so forth. So that's why we have to work to change that. The opposite, the antidote to anger, patience, it doesn't just spontaneously arise the way anger does. We have to work to change. And then these 5 appropriated aggregates they're called appropriated because through the force of karma, we take rebirth into the set of aggregates. And they are samsara. And that process of taking rebirth into them is samsara. So secondly, they're vessels for suffering based on what presently exists. So just based on the karma that we already have, then we'll, in this very life itself, we'll experience suffering inevitably, no matter how well we practice. Then they're vessels for the suffering of suffering. So this body and mind, the way they exist now, they will, they're like containers for. They will give rise to, like a petri dish in which things grow. They'll give rise to the suffering of suffering. They're vessels for the suffering of change, and they're vessels for pervasive compounding suffering and creating the causes of those. So that's kind of most fundamental kind of suffering, just like of the suffering of change and pervasive compounding suffering. pervasive compounding suffering is the most fundamental one. Then of these 6 types of sufferings and 8 types of sufferings, just the suffering of having these appropriated aggregates, essentially of being in samsara, is the most fundamental one. So the one, we should spend the most time trying to recognize in our own experience. So we just have a few minutes left. We won't have time to meditate again today, but maybe next week at the beginning of the session, again, we'll review by reflecting on these. So I encourage you in the intervening week to do the readings and review these by reading about them a bit more, or at least I'll send out the outlines. So I'll send out, actually, I divided up all the required readings for this module. I divided up by per session. So that should be emailed to you shortly, that kind of division. And then all the outlines that I've used to make these PowerPoint slides, I have in a Word file. So I'll ask that Venerable Dundrup send those out to you. So there's the outlines from last session and then outlines from this session. It should be coming to you shortly. So you can also use those as a basis for meditation. But generally, when you're meditating on those topics, it's good to have, a book, either with a description or some outlines, some notes in front of you, or your own notes. And then, do the preparation, refuge, and bodhicitta motivation, and then spend some time just reflecting on them, one by one, kind of clarifying your own understanding, using your own examples, looking at your own experience, looking at whatever doubts or questions you might have regarding them, and try to address those, clear those doubts up different ways. And essentially try to come to a deeper understanding of these different kinds of suffering in samsara, and then dedicate at the end. So if there's any questions now, we can try to answer. Otherwise, we'll just dedicate. Okay, then let's read a few verses of dedication prayer. Actually, I don't. Okay, why don't we read? There's 2 columns here. Read at least. I think we have time to read them all. So this is from the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Why don't we dedicate with these? Since we've been talking about suffering so much, then we can dedicate that ourselves and other sentient beings be free from these forms of suffering. And so, of course, the big question is it really possible to be utterly free from these or not? Anyway, we can rejoice in all our own efforts this session. So by the force of whatever merit we've created, then may the blind see forms, may the deaf hear sounds, may the naked find clothing, the hungry find food, may the thirsty find water and delicious drinks, may the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy, may the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments, and may every disease in the world never occur again. May this frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting one another. May no living creature ever suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, or their minds ever be depressed. If in those who encounter me a faithful or an angry thought arises, may that eternally become the source for fulfilling all their wishes. May all those who say bad things to me or cause me any other harm, and those who mock and insult me have the fortune to fully awaken. May I be a doctor and the medicine, and may I be the nurse for all sick beings in the world until everyone is healed. May a rain of food and drink descend to clear away the pain of thirst and hunger, and during the eon of famine, may I myself change into food and drink. May I become an inexhaustible treasure for those who are poor and destitute, and may I turn into all things they could need, and may these be placed close beside them. May I be a protector for those without one, a guide for all travelers on the way. May I be a bridge, a boat, and a ship for all who wish to cross the ocean. May I be an island for those who seek one, and a lamp for all those who desire light. May I be a bed for all who wish to rest, and a servant for all who want a servant. And until they pass away from pain, may I also be the source of life for all the varied realms of beings that reach into the ends of space, just like space and the great elements such as earth. May I always support the life of all the boundless creatures for as long as space remains and for as long as sentient beings remain. Until then, may I to remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And then long life prayer for His Holiness Dalai Lama, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. Being incomparably kind, supreme Tenzin Gyatso, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Savor of the land of snow teachings and transmigratory beings, who extensively clarifies the path that unifies emptiness and compassion. To lotus holder Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then may Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who passed away recently, who could show that aspect of emanating again in this world to continue to guide and teach all of his students and all sentient beings. And may this center, I think it's Nobuling, Santa Fe, may it continue to flourish and have all the requisite conditions to do so. And may all of your own prayers be fulfilled in accordance with your wish. Okay, thank you all. That's all for this week.
Thank you, Venerable.